This story didn't scream for attention, but signs were always there, you just need to look closer. This is hidden witness. He left his DNA on a chicken bone. 9 years later, police found him. What if the person who murdered 7 people left his DNA behind on something he thought was worthless? Not a fingerprint, not a weapon, not a photograph, a piece of chicken. On January 8, 1993, 7 people were murdered inside a Brown's Chicken restaurant in Palatine, Illinois. The case shocked the entire Chicago area, and for more than 9 years, the killers remained free. Thousands of leads came in. Suspects were investigated, but nothing seemed to connect the crime to the people responsible. Then investigators remembered something that had been sitting in evidence for years. A partially eaten chicken dinner. And on one of the bones, there was saliva, DNA, a tiny biological trace left behind by someone who thought he had gotten away with murder. This is the story of the Brown's Chicken Massacre, and the chicken bone that helped expose one of its killers. A quiet suburban Chicago street at night in January 1993, exterior of a small fast food chicken restaurant glowing under cold winter lights, police cars arriving in the distance, snow on the ground, ominous true crime documentary atmosphere, photorealistic cinematic lighting. 16:9, no text, no gore. It was Friday, January 8, 1993. Palatine was a suburban community northwest of Chicago. That evening, Brown's Chicken and Pasta was open for business. Inside were employees finishing another shift. Among them were the restaurant's owners, Richard and Lynn Ahlenfeld. There were also 5 employees: Guadalupe Maldonado, Michael C. Castro, Rico L. Solis, Thomas Menz, and Marcus Nelson. 7 people in total. Nobody inside that restaurant knew that the night was about to become one of the most notorious crimes in the Chicago suburbs. Palatine, Illinois suburban shopping area recreated in 1993, Brown's Chicken restaurant exterior at night, winter snow, customers' cars in parking lot, nostalgic 1990s true crime documentary style, photorealistic. 16:9. At some point during the evening, 2 men entered the restaurant. Investigators would later identify them as Juan Luna and James Degorski. Luna had previously worked at the restaurant. According to the prosecution's case, the 2 men entered around closing time. What happened next was horrific. The employees were forced toward the back of the restaurant. The victims were killed. Their bodies were eventually discovered inside the restaurant's walk-in refrigerator. 7 lives had been taken, and the killers were gone. Brown's Chicken restaurant interior after closing time, empty dining area, chairs and tables, dim fluorescent lights, abandoned counter, winter darkness visible through windows, respectful non-graphic true crime reconstruction, cinematic photorealism. 16:9. The following day, the crime scene was discovered. Police entered the restaurant and found the 7 victims. The scale of the crime shocked the community. This wasn't simply a robbery. 7 people had been murdered, and whoever had done it had disappeared into the suburbs. Investigators began collecting evidence. Fingerprints, statements, physical evidence, anything that might reveal who had been inside the restaurant that night. But one of the most unusual pieces of evidence was something investigators might easily have overlooked. Food. 1993 police officers and forensic investigators arriving outside a suburban fast food restaurant at night. Police tape. Emergency lights reflecting on wet pavement. Investigators entering the building. No bodies or gore shown. Cinematic true crime documentary realism. 16:9. Jane Homer was a forensic investigator working on the case. Hours after the murders were discovered, she noticed discarded chicken bones in the restaurant's trash. She had a simple thought. What if the killer had eaten here? What if saliva remained on the food? At the time, DNA technology wasn't advanced enough to give investigators the answer they hoped for. But Homer preserved the evidence. The chicken bones were placed into a freezer, and there they stayed. For years. Imagine that. While the case slowly became colder, a tiny piece of evidence was sitting in storage. waiting for science to catch up. Forensic investigator in a 1993 crime laboratory carefully placing a partially eaten chicken bone into an evidence container. Gloves, evidence labels, cold storage freezer in background, realistic forensic documentary style. No gore, 16. 9. The investigation continued for years. Thousands of leads were pursued. But no arrest came. The case became a cold case. Families waited for answers. The community waited. And investigators continued looking. Then, in 2002, more than 9 years after the murders, the investigation suddenly changed direction. A woman named Ann Lockett, who had previously dated James Degorski, came forward with information. She told police that Degorski and Luna had discussed their involvement in the murders. Her information gave investigators something they had desperately needed. A new direction, but they still needed evidence. Something that could connect the suspects to the crime. And that's when the old evidence became incredibly important. Detectives' office filled with Brown's chicken case files, hundreds of folders, photographs, maps, telephone notes and evidence boxes, calendar pages changing from 1993 to 2002, cinematic investigative documentary style, photorealistic, 16. 9. DNA technology had improved dramatically since 1993. Investigators were now able to examine biological material that had previously been far less useful. And the old chicken bone finally had something to say. Scientists obtained DNA from saliva left on the partially eaten chicken. The sample was compared with DNA from a suspect. And in May 2002, the DNA matched Juan Luna. The strange little piece of evidence that had been sitting in a freezer for years had suddenly become a major part of the investigation. The killer had apparently left behind something he never expected investigators to use against him. His own biological signature. Modern forensic DNA laboratory processing an old evidence sample from a 1993 cold case. Scientist examining DNA profile on computer screen. Preserved evidence container nearby. Blue laboratory lighting. Cinematic true crime realism. 16. 9. On May 16, 2002, police arrested Juan Luna. James Degorski was arrested the same day. After more than 9 years, the Brown's chicken case was no longer a mystery without suspects. But an arrest wasn't the end. It was the beginning of another long chapter. The evidence would have to survive court. The allegations would have to be proven. And the families would finally have to hear the story of what happened to their loved ones. Palatine police investigators in 2002 preparing an arrest operation, surveillance vehicle parked near suburban street, detectives reviewing files, tense documentary atmosphere, cinematic photorealism, 16. 9. During the investigation, Juan Luna gave police a videotaped statement. The recording lasted about 43 minutes. In it, prosecutors said Luna described the events inside the restaurant. His account became another major piece of evidence. But the prosecution's case wasn't based on the chicken DNA alone. There was also a partial palm print. There was the information provided by Ann Lockett. There were statements from other witnesses. And there was Luna's own recorded account. The investigation had transformed from a 9-year mystery into a courtroom battle. 2002 interrogation room recreated realistically, male suspect seated at a table while detectives observe from across the room. Video recording equipment visible, tense courtroom documentary atmosphere, cinematic lighting, photorealistic, 16. 9. In 2007, Juan Luna went to trial. Prosecutors presented evidence connecting him to the murders. The chicken DNA was one of the most memorable pieces. Because it told a simple story. Someone had eaten chicken at the restaurant. Someone had left saliva behind. And years later, investigators were able to connect that DNA to Luna. But there was an important complication. The chicken sample contained DNA from more than one contributor. At least 2 DNA profiles were detected. One matched Luna. The other was not publicly identified as Degorski. That detail is important because real investigations are rarely as simple as a headline makes them sound. The chicken bone was powerful evidence. But it was one piece of a much larger case. Chicago area courtroom recreated in 2007, jury listening to prosecutors present evidence, courtroom sketch-like cinematic realism, defendant seated with attorney, serious atmosphere, no graphic content, 16:9. On May 10, 2007, Juan Luna was convicted of 7 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. James Degorski was tried separately. In 2009, he was also convicted of 7 counts of first-degree murder. He received life imprisonment without parole. The case that had haunted Palatine for more than 9 years had finally reached the courtroom. But the story wasn't really about the killers. It was about 7 people whose lives ended on an ordinary Friday night. Richard Ahlenfelt, Lynn Ahlenfelt, Guadalupe Maldonado, Michael Castro, Rico Solis, Thomas Menz, and Marcus Nelson. 7 names, 7 families, 7 lives, memorial candles and 7 small flowers arranged respectfully outside a suburban Chicago location at dusk, soft winter light, emotional true crime documentary ending, no graphic content, photorealistic, 16:9. The most remarkable part of this case isn't that investigators found DNA. It's when they found it. The evidence had existed since 1993, but technology wasn't ready to fully exploit it. Years passed. The evidence remained, and eventually forensic science caught up. That is one of the most important lessons from cold cases. Evidence doesn't always become useless with age. Sometimes, the technology changes. A fingerprint that once couldn't be compared. A DNA sample that once seemed too weak. A photograph that once looked meaningless. A tiny object that nobody understood. And suddenly, years later, it becomes the clue that changes everything. Extreme close-up of a preserved chicken bone inside a forensic evidence bag beside a DNA profile on a computer screen, dramatic laboratory lighting, symbolic true crime visual, photorealistic, cinematic, 16:9. Think about the irony. The killers may have believed they had left the restaurant behind. They may have believed the crime would eventually fade from public memory. But investigators had preserved something they had thrown away. Something ordinary. Something disposable. A chicken bone. It sat in a freezer while the case grew cold. 9 years passed, and then science gave investigators another chance. The bone couldn't speak. It couldn't tell detectives what happened. But it carried something much more powerful. A biological trace. And that trace helped point investigators toward Juan Luna. Dark forensic evidence room with a single evidence box from 1993, illuminated by a narrow beam of light, symbolic representation of preserved evidence waiting for years. Cinematic true crime mystery, photorealistic, 16:9. A piece of chicken cannot solve a murder. Not by itself, but the smallest piece of evidence can sometimes become part of the chain that finally leads investigators to the truth. In the Brown's chicken case, a discarded meal became one of the most unforgettable clues in the investigation. 7 people were murdered. A community waited. A case went cold. And then, more than 9 years later, a piece of chicken helped connect investigators to one of the men convicted of those murders. The lesson is simple. Never assume evidence is meaningless. Never assume a case is truly dead. And never assume the smallest clue can't matter. Because sometimes, the thing a killer throws away is the very thing that eventually brings him back into the light. This was the Brown's Chicken Massacre. 7 victims, 9 years without an arrest, and one tiny piece of evidence that helped change everything. This is hidden witness. And sometimes, the smallest witness has the loudest voice. The end-empty Brown's Chicken location represented symbolically at night, distant Chicago suburban lights, 7 candles glowing in foreground, subtle forensic evidence box beside them, emotional cinematic true crime ending, photorealistic, 16:9. Thanks for watching. If you saw what others missed, join the hidden witness. Like, subscribe, and we'll see you in the shadows.